The moment Martha Hawkins stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, she felt the weight of every single pair of eyes in town land on her like a brand pressed to cattle hide, and she lifted her chin and stared right back at all of them. She had buried her husband 6 weeks prior in Abilene. Robert Hawkins had been a gentle man, a bookkeeper with soft hands and a quiet voice, and he had died of a fever that swept through the town with a cruelty that left no room for goodbyes. He had been 31 years old. Martha had been 28. They had been married 4 years, and in those 4 years she had learned that life held no guarantees, no softness, no quarter given to those who stood still and waited for better days to arrive. So she had packed what remained of her life into a single trunk and one carpetbag, sold the modest house Robert had rented, and she had climbed onto a stagecoach heading southwest because her late husband's cousin, a woman named Eliza Marsh, had written to her 3 weeks after the funeral and offered her a room and a fresh start in a town called Redemption Creek. The letter had said the town was growing. It had said there was opportunity. What it had not said was that Redemption Creek sat at the edge of a territory where the law was thin as paper and twice as easy to tear. The main street was wide and dusty, with a general store, a livery, a small church with a listing steeple, a saloon called the Dusty Rose that occupied the largest building on the block, and a scattering of other establishments doing what business they could in a place where cash money was sometimes scarce and barter was still considered polite commerce. The town had maybe 300 souls in it, with more arriving every season, drawn by the railroad surveys that promised the iron track would eventually push through this part of Texas and turn the whole region into something prosperous and permanent. Martha set her carpetbag down on the wooden boardwalk and pressed her hands to the small of her back, working out the ache of 2 days riding on roads that felt more like dried river beds than actual thoroughfares. She was looking for Eliza Marsh's house, which the letter had described as being on the north end of town, painted yellow with white shutters, though some of the paint was peeling. That was when she saw him. He was standing outside the livery, and he was the roughest-looking man she had ever laid eyes on in her entire 28 years of living. He was tall, probably 3 or 4 inches over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of a dark canvas work shirt that had been washed so many times it had faded to the color of old storm clouds. His jaw was covered in a short, dark beard that was not carefully groomed, but rather the kind that happened to a man who occasionally forgot to shave, because there were other things occupying his attention. His hat was pulled low, a battered thing with a sweat-darkened band, and his boots were caked in red-brown Texas dust. He had a rifle leaned against the livery wall beside him, and he was sharpening a knife on a whetstone with the slow, focused attention of a man who took his tools seriously. His hands were enormous. The knuckles were scarred. There was a faded crescent-shaped mark along his left jaw that looked like an old wound healed over time, and there was a quality to him, even at a distance, that made Martha think of thunderclouds building over flatland, the kind of weather you respected because it was powerful and unpredictable and very indifferent indifferent to whether or not you were ready for it. She looked at him for perhaps 3 seconds before she gathered herself, picked up her carpetbag, and asked a woman passing by with a market basket if she could point her toward Eliza Marsh's yellow house. She did not think about the rough man again. She had enough on her hands. Eliza Marsh was a practical woman of 35 with strong forearms and a way of speaking that cut straight to the point without being unkind. She was a widow herself, 2 years now, her husband having been thrown from a horse. She ran a small boarding house that took in 4 lodgers at a time, and she supplemented that income by taking in mending and doing alterations for the handful of women in town who had the means to want their clothes fitted properly. The room Eliza offered Martha was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the back garden where someone had planted a vegetable patch, with an ambition that had been only partially matched by the actual harvest. There was a narrow bed with a quilt, A washstand, a small mirror that had been nailed to the wall at a slight angle so that Martha's reflection always appeared to be leaning thoughtfully to one side, and a wooden chair by the window. Martha sat on the edge of the bed after Eliza left her to settle in, and she looked at her hands in her lap and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of feeling the full weight of her grief, the silence of a world without Robert's quiet presence in it, the enormity of starting over in a place where nobody knew her name or her history or the precise particular shape of her sadness. She counted the minutes in her head. When 10 had passed, she stood up, took off her traveling coat and went downstairs to ask Eliza how she could be useful. She could cook. She could sew. She had a good head for figures, having helped Robert with his bookkeeping sometimes, sitting beside him at the kitchen table with the ledger spread between them. She could read and write better than most people she had met. In Abilene, she had kept a small kitchen garden. She was not someone who needed to be taken care of, but she was also, at this particular moment in her life, someone who was grateful to be taken in. Eliza had her cooking breakfast for the boarders within 2 days, and within a week, word had gotten around that Eliza Marsh's boarding house was now serving the best biscuits in Redemption Creek, which was not a small claim given that the baker 2 streets over had been operating for 3 years. Martha did not mean it as a competition. She just knew how to make biscuits. The town began to reveal itself to her in the way that small towns always do, slowly and sideways, through gossip and observation, and the things people said when they thought they were only making conversation. She learned that the sheriff was a man named Cecil Tate, who was competent enough for ordinary disputes, but who was known to go carefully around the rougher element of men who used Redemption Creek as a way station between drives. She learned that there was a small schoolhouse on the eastern edge of town, and that it was desperately short of a proper teacher, the last one having left in February to marry a man in San Antonio. She learned that the railroad survey was real, but that the actual arrival of the track was still years off, maybe more. She learned that the surrounding ranches were what kept the town alive, and that the largest of these was a spread called the Double G, which ran cattle and horses both, and was operated by a taciturn, reclusive man whom the townspeople referred to by various descriptions that circled around the same central idea, that he was not someone you wanted to cross, but that if he gave you his word, you could build a house on it. It was Eliza who told her his name. They were sitting on the front porch in the early evening of Martha's 9th day in Redemption Creek, shelling peas into a tin bowl, and Eliza mentioned the Double G Ranch in the context of saying that she sometimes took in laundry from the ranch hands when the drive brought them through, and that the owner usually paid promptly and without complaint. "His name is Jasper Graves," Eliza said. "You have probably seen him in town. Hard to miss." Martha thought of the man outside the livery. "The knife and the whetstone and the scarred knuckles. I think I might have," she said. "He keeps to himself mostly," Eliza continued, dropping a clean pile of peas into the bowl with a satisfying rattle. "Lost his family young, mother and father both, and an older brother too, fever and a bad winter, years ago now. Built that ranch from nothing, literally nothing, started with $40 and a handful of cattle he won in a card game, and worked himself half to death for 8 years to make it what it is. Men who work for him say he is fair and harder on himself than he is on anyone else." She paused. "He can be rough around the edges in the way that men become when they spend more time with cattle than people. Not mean, just unused to softness." Martha nodded and said nothing, and they finished shelling the peas as the sun went down behind the low hills to the west and turned the sky the color of a peach left too long in the sun. She did not seek out Jasper Graves. She was 28 years old and 6 weeks a widow, and she had come to Redemption Creek to build a new life on steady ground, not to complicate things further by paying attention to rough-edged ranchers with scarred hands and battered hats. She had enough to occupy herself. Within a month, she had inquired about the school and had been invited to speak with the town council about the vacancy. The council was 3 men: the mayor, a storekeeper, and a rancher from a smaller spread north of town, and they were all quietly surprised that she had formal schooling herself, which she did, having attended a girls' academy in Ohio until she was 16 before her family's finances had required her to give it up. She knew arithmetic and geography and grammar and history, and she was organized and patient, which were the primary qualities a frontier schoolteacher needed beyond basic literacy. They offered her the position on a trial basis at $30 a month, which was not generous but was manageable alongside her room and board at Eliza's, and she accepted it without negotiating, which she later thought she probably should have done. The school had 14 students ranging from age 6 to 15, and they were as varied in their prior education as they were in their temperament, which is to say wildly. 3 of the younger ones had never held a pencil. The oldest, a 15-year-old boy named Tom Beecham, whose father ran the livery, could already read competently but had a deep resistance to any mathematics beyond basic addition, a resistance he expressed through strategic invisibility, the particular talent that some students develop of making themselves seem physically present while being mentally somewhere else entirely. Martha found that she loved teaching. This surprised her slightly because she had not known it about herself before, but there was something about the particular combination of patience and structure, and the small visible moments of a child understanding something new that suited some deep part of her nature that she had not had occasion to use before. She settled into a routine. Mornings at the school, afternoons at Eliza's, evenings sometimes on the porch or walking the main street in the cooling air if the day had been particularly warm. She went to church on Sundays, where Reverend Alcott gave sermons that were earnest if occasionally overlong, and she began to know the names of people and the particular webs of their connections to one another that constituted the living tissue of a community. She saw Jasper Graves in town 4 more times in those first weeks, always at a distance, always either at the livery or at the general store, never staying long, never appearing to seek conversation. He was always alone. He moved through the street the way large, self-contained things move, with a kind of unhurried certainty that cleared a path without demanding one. People nodded to him respectfully. He nodded back. He never seemed to look in her direction, which was fine, which was entirely fine. The night things changed was a Thursday in July, when the heat had come down on Redemption Creek with the particular fury of a Texas summer that has decided it has been patient long enough. Martha had been at the school until past 4 in the afternoon, helping young Anna Whitfield, who was 7 and bright as a new penny, work through a difficulty with reading that Martha was beginning to think might be something more structural than simple unfamiliarity with the letters. She walked home in the heavy heat and ate supper with Eliza and the 3 current boarders, 2 traveling salesmen and a quiet older man who was surveying land for a potential cattle operation, and then she sat for a while on the porch until the air cooled slightly and then went to bed. She lay awake for a long time. This was becoming a habit. Sleep had been difficult since Robert died, not dramatic sleeplessness, not the kind that left her wild-eyed and trembling, just a persistent lightness, a fragility of rest, in which she would drift down toward sleep and then some small sound or the particular quality of the darkness would bring her back up to the surface again, and she would lie there listening to the night sounds of the town and the countryside beyond it, the distant call of a night bird, the occasional sounds from the saloon 2 streets over, the creaking of the boarding house settling around her, and she would feel the full specific loneliness of lying in a strange bed, in a strange town, in a life that looked nothing at. All like the life she had been expecting to have. By 2 in the morning she gave up, dressed quietly, and went downstairs to sit in the kitchen with a cup of water because the pump was there, and the kitchen was cooler than her room. She lit the small lamp on the table and sat at it, not reading, just sitting, listening to the nighttime quiet. She heard the horse before she heard anything else, and then she heard boots on the boardwalk outside, and then a knock at the front door that was not aggressive but was firm enough to suggest that Whoever was knocking considered the errand important. She went to the door. She was careful about it, because this was 1878 in Redemption Creek, and she was a woman alone in a house at 2 in the morning, and caution was not paranoia but sense. She opened the door a crack and looked out. Jasper Graves was standing on the porch. He had his hat in his hands, which she took as a sign that whatever had brought him here was not violent business. His expression was difficult to read in the low light, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested discomfort, not the discomfort of a man about to do something threatening, but the discomfort of a man who was doing something that did not come naturally to him. "Ma'am," he said, "I apologize for the hour. I need to speak with Mrs. Marsh if she is up. I have 2 of her boarders here." He paused. "They were in an altercation at the Dusty Rose. They are not seriously hurt, but they need somewhere to sleep that isn't the sheriff's holding cell, and Sheriff Tate asked me to bring them home." Martha looked past him. There were indeed 2 figures in the street behind him, the 2 traveling salesmen, both of them looking rumpled and sheepish and slightly worse for whatever evening they had managed to have. "I will get Eliza," Martha said. She went upstairs, woke Eliza with a brief explanation, and came back down. Eliza appeared in her wrapper 2 minutes later, took one sharp look at the 2 salesmen, and with the efficiency of a woman who had seen similar things before, directed Jasper to bring them in and pointed them toward the kitchen with instructions to sit and be quiet while she fetched iodine and bandaging. Jasper brought them in and deposited them on the kitchen chairs with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to moving unwilling or incapable people from one place to another. He straightened up and looked around the kitchen and noticed the lamp already lit and the cup of water on the table. He looked at Martha. "Were you already up?" he asked. His voice was low, a little rough at the edges, but not unkind. There was something careful in the way he asked it, like a man who is not used to asking things but has asked this specific question deliberately. "I was," she said. She moved to stand by the counter, giving Eliza room to work. There was a pause. He held his hat and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely decode. "How are you sleeping?" he asked. "In general, in a new place." It was such an unexpected question from such an unexpected source that Martha stood very still for a moment, genuinely disarmed by it. Of all the things she might have expected this man to say, this was not among them. The traveling salesmen were being attended to by Eliza. The kitchen lamp threw warm gold light across the table, and the copper pots hanging on the wall and the rough planes of Jasper Graves's face, and he was watching her with a directness that was oddly gentle for a face that looked as though gentleness had never had particular cause to live there. "Not well, to be honest," she said. She did not know why she answered honestly. Maybe because the hour was 2 in the morning, and the normal guards people kept up in daylight hours felt faintly ridiculous at 2 in the morning. Maybe because she was tired enough that honest was easier than constructed. Maybe because something in the way he had asked it suggested that he already knew the answer and was asking not to gather information but to give her permission to say the truth out loud. He nodded slowly. "New places take getting used to," he said. "Worse after a loss." She looked at him. He was not looking away. "You know about the loss," she said. "Small town," he said simply. "Mrs. Marsh mentioned it to the Reverend, and the Reverend mentioned it to the congregation, and I happened to be in the church pew at the back for reasons I will not bore you with." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I am sorry for it, the loss. It is a hard thing." It was such a plain and sincere statement, delivered without decoration or the self-conscious awkwardness that people usually brought to condolence, that Martha felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once, put his hat back on, told Eliza that he was glad the men were in safe hands, and that he would tell the sheriff the matter was handled, and then he walked back out into the 2 in the morning dark without ceremony. Martha stood by the counter for a moment after the door closed. She did not know what to do with that. She went back to bed and, for the first time in weeks, slept straight through until morning. The next time she saw Jasper Graves was at the general store, 4 days later. He was picking up supplies, a long list of them by the look of what was being assembled on the counter by the storekeeper's wife, and he was standing to one side waiting when Martha came in to buy writing paper and ink for the school. She was browsing along the shelf where the stationery goods were kept when she heard him say something to the storekeeper's wife about a bolt of blue fabric and whether it could be ordered in, and she found herself glancing sideways at him and then away again before he could notice. He noticed. "Good morning, Mrs. Hawkins," he said. His voice carried the particular quality of a voice that was used to being heard across open distances, clear without being loud. "Good morning, Mr. Graves," she said, and was faintly embarrassed to find that she had remembered his name without having been formally introduced to him. But he did not seem to find it strange. "How is the school?" he asked. She turned more fully toward him now, because looking away from someone who was speaking directly to you was rude, and she had been raised not to be rude. "It is going well," she said. "We have 14 students and they are a good group mostly. I am working on getting them all to the same basic level before the summer heat breaks." He nodded. "Several of those children are from families that work on ranches in the area," he said. Including 3 from the Double G, he said it without self-importance, as a statement of fact. "I have been meaning to speak with someone at the school about ensuring the schedule allows for children who need to help during certain seasons, calving harvest, that sort of thing." "Come by any time," Martha said. "I would rather work with a family's needs than against them." A child who is here part of the time learns more than a child who stops coming entirely, because the schedule does not accommodate his family's reality. Something shifted in Jasper's expression. Not a smile exactly, or not what most people would call a smile, but a slight easing in the set of his jaw that suggested approval, or at least that she had said something he agreed with. "That is a sensible way to think about it," he said. "I try," she said. She took her writing paper and ink to the counter. He was still being loaded up with his order. Their interaction lasted perhaps 3 minutes total. She went back to the school and thought about the particular way he had looked at her during that slight easing of his jaw, and then told herself firmly that she had more important things to be thinking about and applied herself to Anna Whitfield's reading difficulties with redoubled attention. He came by the school the following week on a Tuesday afternoon, after the children had gone home for the day. She was erasing the chalkboard and turned to find him in the doorway, hat in his hands again, the afternoon light behind him. He looked even larger in a small schoolroom than he did in the open street. They talked for half an hour about the 3 children from the Double G, a boy of 10 named Eddie and 2 younger girls, all of them children of ranch hands, and about the general rhythm of ranch work through the seasons and how it intersected with the school calendar. He was direct and specific, and he did not waste words on conversational filler, but he also listened carefully when she spoke, with an attention that felt complete rather than polite. When she explained her concern about Anna Whitfield, he did not dismiss it or tell her she was probably overcomplicating a simple matter of a child being slow to start, the way she had half expected someone to. Instead, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "I knew a man once who read backwards, letters all reversed in his mind, could not make heads or tails of a page, but he could calculate distances and weights in his head to 4 decimal places. His mind just worked differently from the standard pattern. Might be worth considering." Martha looked at him with some surprise. "That is exactly what I have been thinking," she said. He met her eyes briefly and then looked at his hat. "I will not take more of your time," he said, and put the hat back on and left. She stood in the empty schoolroom for a moment, looking at the doorway he had just vacated, and thought about how strange it was, the combination of absolute external roughness and the quality of attention he brought to a conversation when he chose to bring it. It was like finding a still, clear well at the bottom of a field that looked, from the outside, like it was only good for growing rocks. She walked home in the warm evening light and found herself noticing the way the light turned the dust in the street to gold, and she thought that Redemption Creek was, in its own particular way, beautiful, and she did not know exactly when she had started thinking of it that way. July gave way to August, which was hotter, and then slowly to September, which began to introduce itself as the suggestion of something cooler eventually arriving, though it was in no particular hurry to follow through on the promise. Martha had been in Redemption Creek for 4 months. She had 20 students now, because 2 new families had arrived in the late summer, and she had written to the town council asking for additional primers and chalk, and the repair of 3 benches that were becoming structurally unreliable in ways that were going to result in someone sitting on the floor rather sooner than later. She had also, in the interval, spoken with Jasper Graves perhaps 8 times. The conversations were always brief and almost always practical in subject, and they nearly always left her feeling as though she had learned something or had been seen in some specific way that felt significant without being demonstrable. She was aware that she looked for his horse when she was on the main street. She was aware that, when Eliza mentioned him in passing, she paid closer attention than she paid to information about most people. She was also aware that these were facts she was not quite ready to examine directly, preferring to regard them from a slight sideways angle, the way you regard something bright without wanting to look at it straight on. What she did not know, and what she would not know until considerably later, was that Jasper Graves had increased the frequency of his supply runs to town from twice a month to every week and a half, and that the storekeeper's wife, who noticed things the way all good storekeepers' wives do, had mentioned this to Eliza Marsh over the fence one morning with an expression that communicated more than her words did. Eliza did not tell Martha this. She was not the kind of woman who pushed. But she did, around this time, begin making sure there was a spare chair on the porch in the evenings, just in case. The situation that brought things into sharper focus was a series of events that began on a Wednesday in October when the 2 older Whitfield brothers, the fathers of several of her students, had a dispute with a group of passing cattlemen over water rights on a section of land to the east of town. The dispute became heated and then became physical, and the sheriff was involved. And for 3 days the town had the particular electric quality of a place where something might catch fire if the wrong thing happened at the wrong moment. Sheriff Tate managed it barely, with a combination of firmness and the particular kind of persuasion that involves reminding people what the alternative looks like. But the tension left a residue in the town, a watchfulness, a slight drawing inward of all the ordinary daily things that made the place feel safe and ordinary. Martha felt it in her students, who were quieter than usual and more easily startled by loud sounds, and she spent more time in those 3 days simply maintaining a feeling of calm and normalcy in the schoolroom than she did actually teaching, which she had come to understand was also part of the work. On the 3rd evening of the tension, she was walking back from the school alone, a little later than usual because she had stayed to prepare the next week's lessons, and she had just turned the corner onto the street that led to Eliza's when a man she did not recognize stepped out from beside the hardware store and asked her something about where the Dusty Rose was, in a way that had nothing to do with directions and everything to do with assessing whether she was someone who could be intimidated. She held herself very still and said that she did not know and kept walking. The man said something unpleasant at her back. She kept walking. Her heart was beating harder than usual, but her face stayed composed and her pace stayed steady. "Mrs. Hawkins." The voice came from across the street, deep, calm, carrying. She glanced over and Jasper Graves was there, standing at the edge of the boardwalk, looking not at her but at the man who had spoken to her back. His expression was completely neutral in the way that certain things are completely neutral right before they are not. The man behind Martha looked at Jasper for a moment, assessed the particular quality of Jasper's neutrality, and found some other place to be. He was gone before Martha had drawn a second breath. She crossed the street to Jasper. Her heart was still going at its elevated pace. "Thank you," she said. "He was with the Dawson crew," Jasper said. He was looking down the street, not at her. They have been trouble for 2 days. Tate will want to know he is still in town. I am all right, she said. She had said it to answer a question he had not asked yet. He looked at her then. The evening light was falling sideways across his face, and she could see the exact color of his eyes for the first time clearly. A dark brown that was almost black in some lights, but in this particular light had the color of good river water, deep and clear. I know you are, he said. You walked steady. Something about the simple recognition of that made her feel unreasonably like she might cry, not from fear but from the particular release of being seen doing a hard thing well. I try, she said. It was what she had said to him in the store weeks ago. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something on its way to becoming one. He walked her to Eliza's door. They did not speak very much along the way, but the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not require filling. At the door she thanked him again, and he nodded and went back down the porch steps, and she stood at the door and watched him walk back down the street in the orange evening light, his hat low, his stride unhurried, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her with its simplicity, that she would very much like to know this man better. She went inside and told Eliza what had happened, and Eliza listened and was appropriately concerned about the man from the Dawson crew, and then she said, "Jasper Graves walked you home," in a tone that was so carefully neutral that Martha looked at her sharply. "He was nearby," Martha said. "He is often nearby when you are in town," Eliza said, and then went to stir something on the stove with the energy of a woman who has said what she wanted to say and considers the matter advanced sufficiently. Martha sat down at the kitchen table and thought about that for a while. She told herself she needed to be careful. She was still grieving, still finding her footing in a new place, still building the architecture of a life that could support itself. She was not someone who had come to Redemption Creek looking for a man, and she was not someone who needed one to make her circumstances work. She was doing perfectly well. The school was going well. She was saving a small portion of her monthly wage. She had friends, in the beginning stages of that word's full meaning, in Eliza and in the Reverend's wife, and in the storekeeper's wife who had taken to sending her home with small gifts of particular spices she happened to have an excess of. She was doing perfectly well. But she was also awake at 1 in the morning 4 nights later, which was not unusual, and she was sitting in the kitchen with her cup of water, which was also not unusual, and she was thinking about the color of Jasper Graves's eyes in the evening light, which was new. The knock at the door was not new, but it was later this time, nearly 2 and more tentative. She went to the door with the same caution as before and opened it, and it was Jasper, hat in his hands, and he looked different from how he usually looked. He looked, beneath the habitual roughness and the habitual composure, tired in a way that went further down than physical tiredness. He had a small cut above his right eyebrow, recent, not serious but not yet fully sealed. "I am sorry to come at this hour again," he said. "I saw the light." "Are you hurt?" she asked, meaning the cut. "No," he said. "This is nothing. There was a problem at the ranch. One of my men got into trouble on the road back from town, and I went to sort it out, and it took longer than I expected." He paused. "I was riding back past here, and I saw the light, and I stopped. I do not know why." It was the most honest thing she had heard a person say in some time. She opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "I was just sitting anyway." He came in with the diffidence of a very large man in a small space, and she put the kettle on the small stove because tea was something she could do, and doing something made the strange hour feel less strange. He sat at the kitchen table and set his hat on the table beside him and looked at his hands for a moment. "How are you sleeping?" he asked, for the second time since they had met, and again the question disarmed her completely. "Better than I was," she said honestly. "Some nights are still hard," he nodded. "It gets easier," he said. "Not completely, but easier." She waited. He was quiet for a moment, arranging something inside himself the way you arrange something heavy before you try to carry it. "I lost my family young," he said. "Mother, father, my brother Thomas, all within 2 years of each other. I was 23. He said it without drama, plainly, the way you state facts that you have had time to live with. I did not know how to be a person in the world for a while after that. I just worked until I could not think anymore. It is not the best way to grieve, but it was the only way I knew. Martha brought the tea to the table and sat down across from him. The lamplight was warm and the kitchen was quiet. I think I have been doing something similar, she said. The school is useful for that. There is always more to do. Yes, he said. He wrapped both hands around the tin cup she had set before him. His hands were very large. The cup looked small in them. But the nights are harder. The nights are harder, she agreed. They sat in the quiet kitchen and drank their tea. And outside, the Texas night was vast and dark, and full of the sounds of creatures going about their nighttime business. And inside the kitchen, there was the small warmth of the lamp and two people sitting at a table together, not performing anything, not managing anything, just being present in each other's company in the particular way that is possible only very late at night, when all the ordinary performances of the day have been set aside. He left 20 minutes later. At the door he paused and turned. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "if you would permit it." Martha looked at him for a moment, at this rough, large, careful man with the scarred hands and the dark eyes, and the way he asked about her sleep like it mattered to him. "I would permit it," she said. He nodded and put his hat on and went out into the dark. She stood at the closed door for a long moment, one hand against the wood, and felt, under the grief and the uncertainty and the strangeness of everything, something that she had not felt in a long time. Something quiet and warm, like a lamp being lit in a room that had been dark for a while. She did not name it yet, but she felt it. He called on her the following Sunday afternoon, arriving at Eliza's with his hat in his hands and his best coat, which was considerably cleaner and more carefully maintained than his working clothes, suggesting that he owned it for specific purposes and took those purposes seriously. Eliza took one look at the two of them sitting in the front parlor and decided she had several things to attend to in the back of the house that would probably take the better part of an hour. The conversation was easier than Martha had expected, given that he was not, by any measurement, a man given to easy social conversation. He asked about the school with genuine interest and listened carefully to her descriptions of the various children and their different ways of learning. She asked about the ranch, and he described the land and the work with a precision and a love for detail that made it clear that the ranch was not a business to him, but a world he had built and inhabited with his whole attention for 8 years. Every fence post and water source and pasture rotation known to him the way a man knows the lines of his own face. She told him about Ohio, her family, the academy, Robert in the way that you tell someone about a person you loved who is gone, carefully with honesty but without the raw edge, because that raw edge was healing slowly. He listened without discomfort or deflection. He did not try to redirect the conversation or offer platitudes. He simply listened, and then said that Robert Hawkins sounded like a man who had been fortunate to be loved by someone as clear-eyed as she was, and she felt the sting of tears and blinked them back and said thank you with a steadiness she was grateful for. He came back the following Sunday, and the one after that. October moved into November and the air sharpened and the evenings came earlier, and the light that fell across the town in the afternoons was the particular gold of autumn in the southwest, rich and slanted, and full of a warmth that was not quite summer but not yet winter. Martha walked to and from the school in a heavier coat. The school stove, a small iron thing in the corner, became relevant. 2 new students arrived, bringing her count to 22. She and Jasper Graves had Sunday afternoons, and sometimes a walk on a Tuesday or Thursday evening when the light was good and his work brought him to town. They walked the edge of the town where the main street gave way to the open scrub country, or along the creek that gave the town its name, a modest watercourse that was full in spring and low in summer, but still running in November, with cottonwood trees along its banks that had turned to brilliant yellow and were losing their leaves in the small morning breezes. He did not talk a great deal on these walks, but what he said was always worth hearing. He noticed things, small things, a pair of particular birds, the angle of light on water, the condition of someone's cropped land visible through a fence, and he spoke about them with the ease of someone who has spent a great deal of time paying attention to the world and finds it, on balance, interesting and worth observing carefully. She noticed that other people in town regarded them with expressions ranging from approval to benign curiosity. Eliza maintained a diplomacy of manner that meant she never said anything directly, but communicated through the quality of the extra care she put into Sunday dinners on the week's Jasper, was expected that she was pleased by the development. The storekeeper's wife was less diplomatic, and told Martha one morning while selling her ink that it was about time someone got through to that man, and that Martha seemed exactly the right kind of woman to manage it. Martha, who did not think of herself as managing Jasper Graves or wanting to, and who thought the storekeeper's wife had rather missed the point of what was happening, said thank you politely and went back to the school. Because what was happening, she understood by late November, was not management or strategy or the calculated pursuit of a socially useful alliance. What was happening was that she had fallen in love with Jasper Graves in the slow, steady way that serious things happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in accumulation, in the daily and weekly addition of small proofs of his character, his consistency, his particular brand of care that expressed itself not in flowery language, but in action and attention, and the question how are you sleeping asked with genuine wanting to know. She was sitting by her window one Sunday evening after he had gone, watching the stars come out over the flat Texas horizon, and she turned this realization over in her mind carefully, checking it for cracks and false surfaces the way you check a thing you are about to trust your weight to. She found none. She was 28 years old and had been loved once and lost that love, and had thought for a while that she was the kind of person whose great experience of love was behind her. She had not come to this conclusion with bitterness, only with what she had believed was realism. She thought now that she had been wrong about that, and that being wrong about it was possibly the best thing that had happened to her in some years. She did not tell him yet. She was not a woman who rushed herself. December arrived and brought with it the first proper cold of the season and the particular activity of a small town preparing to mark Christmas in whatever way it could manage. There was to be a celebration at the church on Christmas Eve, with a supper and music, and the whole town seemed to shift gear slightly in the direction of warmth and effort. Martha threw herself into a Christmas pageant for the school, which her students undertook with a combination of enthusiasm and creative interpretation of their assigned roles that kept her occupied, and more often than she had expected, laughing. Young Anna Whitfield had been making real progress with her reading, a fact that filled Martha with a satisfaction that was both professional and personal, because she had come to be very fond of this small, fierce, clever girl, who simply needed to be taught in a way that accommodated how her particular mind worked. Jasper came to the school Christmas pageant on the Friday before Christmas. He sat in the back row with his hat in his lap, which she noticed from the front of the room, and watched Eddie and the two younger girls from the Double G deliver their lines with varying degrees of success. And when Anna Whitfield stood up and read aloud, slowly but correctly and clearly, a short passage from the Christmas story, he watched with an expression that had in it something that looked like the particular satisfaction of a man who is watching something right happen in the world. After the pageant, when the families had collected their children and the room was mostly clear, he helped her stack the benches back against the wall and found her, when he turned around, standing in the middle of the empty schoolroom looking at him with an expression she had not shown him before, open and clear, and without the slight carefulness that had been in her face toward him for the first months of their knowing each other. "You came to the pageant," she said. "Eddie had a speaking part," he said. And Anna Whitfield read. He paused. She could not read in September. "No," Martha said, "she could not. You figured out how to teach her. "We figured it out together," she said. "She is very determined." He was looking at her steadily, that dark, clear gaze. "You are a remarkable woman, Martha," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. It was not a slip. He said it deliberately, carefully, the way he said things when he meant them the most. She crossed the small distance between them and stood close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, and she said, "I have been in love with you for some weeks now, Jasper. I thought you should know." Something moved through his face that she had never seen there before. Something vast and warm that started at his eyes and worked its way down through all the rough, guarded surfaces of him, and for a moment made him look like what he was, which was a man who had been alone for a very long time and who was standing on the other side of that aloneness at last. He took her face in his hands, those enormous scarred hands that were the gentlest things she had ever felt, and he looked at her for a long moment as though making absolutely certain she was real. "I have been in love with you since the night in the kitchen," he said quietly. "I just did not know for certain that I had the right to say it." She kissed him then, or he kissed her. It was not entirely clear who moved first, and it was a quiet and serious kiss, the kind that belongs to people who have waited for the right thing rather than settling for the convenient one. He asked her to marry him on Christmas Eve, at the church celebration, after the Reverend Alcott's sermon and before the supper. He did not do it in front of everyone, which would have embarrassed them both. He did it in the cold air outside the church door, with the stars overhead and the sound of the town's Christmas music drifting out through the windows, and he held her hands in his and asked her simply and directly, the way he did everything, without ornamentation or theater. She said yes. Eliza cried when they told her, which she would have denied doing if asked directly, but the evidence was clear in her eyes. They were married in February of 1879, on a Saturday when the weather was cold and clear, and the sky over Redemption Creek was the particular deep winter blue of a sky with no intention of changing for some time. Reverend Alcott married them in the church, which was full, because the town had developed a proprietary feeling about the match and considered it an occasion worth attending in numbers. Martha wore a dress she and Eliza had made together, a deep blue wool with cream buttons at the collar, because the blue seemed right for a February wedding in Texas, and because she was not 17 and did not need white to mean something. She wore her hair up with 2 small pins Eliza had given her as a wedding gift, silver pins with small pearl drops. She carried a small bunch of dried lavender and rosemary from Eliza's garden, because nothing was blooming in February, and this smelled like something living and warm. Jasper wore his best coat, which she had now seen enough times to recognize, and a fresh shirt, and boots that had been polished to within an inch of their lives. He had combed his beard. This detail, for some reason that she could not fully explain, made her love him so completely in that moment that she had to press her lips together to maintain any composure at all as she walked down the aisle toward him. He looked at her as she came toward him with that expression she had come to know well by now, the one that started at his eyes and worked its way through all of him, the one that had no guard on it, the one that was purely Jasper Graves telling the truth about what he felt without a single word required. They said their vows in the quiet church with the winter light coming through the windows and the town watching, and Martha thought about Ohio and Robert, and the stagecoach and the boarding house and the kitchen at 2 in the morning, and the creek path in autumn and Anna Whitfield reading her Christmas passage. And she thought that life was, in its way, an extraordinary thing, that it continued, that it surprised you, that it offered things you had not known to ask for. She moved to the ranch in March, once the weather had eased enough that the road was reliable. She brought her trunk and her carpetbag and her school things and a quilt Eliza had given her, and a cooking pot she had acquired herself over the previous months. And Jasper brought all of this in the ranch wagon and installed it in the ranch house, which was a solid, unpretentious structure that had been built to be lived in rather than admired, with a large kitchen that she immediately loved, and a front porch that looked out over a stretch of Texas land that went on to the horizon in every direction and was, in the morning light, something that could take your breath away if you let it. She kept the school. This had been agreed between them without drama. He had never suggested she give it up. She had never imagined she would. The ranch was 2.5 miles from town, close enough for the ride to be manageable in ordinary weather, and Jasper arranged for one of the younger ranch hands to accompany her on the days he could not because she required escorting, but because the road had occasional unpredictability, and two people were simply safer than one on an unpredictable road. She learned the ranch. Not in a supervisory way, not in the way of someone who has married into a business and taken it over, but in the way of someone who is genuinely curious about the world their partner inhabits. She learned the names of the horses. She learned the rhythms of the cattle work through the seasons. She learned the faces and characters of the ranch hands, 8 men in total, a varied group that included an older Mexican vaquero named Felipe who had worked cattle all his life, and whose knowledge of horses was practically supernatural, and a quiet young man named Isaac who had come west from Georgia, and who had about him the watchfulness of someone who had learned early in life not to take safety for granted. She noticed, without making a production of it, that Jasper treated his men fairly. He paid them on time. He did not ask them to do things he would not do himself. When Felipe's horse came up lame in April, Jasper stayed up 2 nights running with the animal, working beside the veterinarian they had brought from town, and the horse recovered. When Isaac, who turned out to have a facility for numbers, asked Jasper shyly one evening if there was any possibility of working on the books rather than only on the cattle, Jasper thought about it for a day and then said yes, on a trial basis. And within a month, Isaac was managing the Double G's accounts with a precision that left Martha, who had helped Robert with his books and had a standard to compare against, quietly impressed. Life on the ranch in 1879 was not gentle. There were difficult months, a summer drought that stressed the grazing land and required moving cattle further than planned, and a dispute with a neighbor over a water source that required Jasper to spend 2 weeks in a state of grinding, controlled tension, while the situation was argued out before the county judge, a process that ultimately went in the Double G's favor on the basis of prior claim documents Jasper had had the foresight to preserve carefully. Through all of it, he was steady in the way that solid things are steady, not unaffected but not swept away, and Martha found that living with this quality, this combination of strength and composure and the fundamental willingness to do what needed doing without self-pity, was one of the things she loved best about him. He was also, away from the public eye, a different person than the one the town saw. Not a different character, but a fuller one, because at home with her, he did not need to maintain the particular compression that social life seemed to require of him. He laughed. Not often and not easily, but when something genuinely amused him, a low, quiet sound that was more felt than heard. He talked to her about things he thought about, ideas he had about the land and its management, questions he had about things he read, because it turned out he read more than most people suspected, keeping a small collection of books in the ranch house that included several histories, a volume of poetry that he would not have admitted to in public, and a battered natural history that he consulted seriously when he found things in the landscape he wanted to understand better. He asked still, at intervals that were not so frequent as to be routine but frequent enough to be a genuine practice, how she was sleeping. She had asked him once why he asked it, in the early months of their marriage, lying in the dark of the ranch house with the Texas night stretching vast and silent outside the window. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Because the nights are when the grief gets in, if it is going to. And if you are not sleeping well, I want to know, so I can be there instead of just lying here not knowing." She had pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him, and thought that this was the most succinct and perfect description of what love in its daily form looked like that she had ever encountered. "I am sleeping very well," she had said. "Good," he said, and pulled her closer, and they lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around them, and she felt the particular peace of being in exactly the right place. In the fall of 1879, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen after supper, sitting at the table where they often sat in the evenings when the work was done, and the house was quiet, and she watched his face as the information moved through him, that progression from stillness to understanding to the slow arrival of something so large that it seemed for a moment to take up all the available space in his expression. He stood up from his chair and came around the table and knelt down beside hers and took her hands in both of his and looked at her, and did not say anything for a long moment, which was very like him. "Are you well?" he asked finally. "Yes," she said. "Very well." "Good," he said. He brought her hands to his mouth and held them there, and she felt the warmth of his breath against her fingers and the roughness of his beard and the particular quality of his grip, strong and absolutely certain. "I am going to be terrible at this," he said into her hands, which she understood to mean that he was going to be terrified and devoted in equal measure, and that he knew the first and intended to defeat it with the second. "You are going to be wonderful at this," she said. "I know you well enough to know that." He looked up at her. That expression, the open one, the unguarded one, with the warmth moving through all the rough planes of his face. "I love you," he said. He did not say it constantly, which meant that every time he did say it, it landed with the full weight of someone who says only what they mean. "I love you," she said back. "Very much." The winter of 1879 passed in the warmth of a house and a life with substance to it. Martha continued to teach until January, when the combination of cold roads and advancing pregnancy made the daily ride to town impractical. She arranged for a temporary teacher to take the school for the remainder of the season, a young woman named Clara Hobbs, who had recently arrived in Redemption Creek with adequate qualifications, and a genuine nervousness about managing 22 children, for whom Martha wrote out extensive notes covering each child's particular learning style and needs, including a detailed note about Anna Whitfield and what worked for her. She spent February on the ranch, reading and sewing and learning more about the kitchen than she had known before because there was time for it now, and having long conversations with Jasper in the evenings about the history of the land they lived on and the people who had lived on it before them, because he knew a great deal about the region's history, including the complex and often painful history of the land's prior inhabitants. The Comanche and other nations who had ranged across this country for generations before the treaties and the conflicts that had displaced them, with a violence and injustice that Jasper spoke about plainly, and without the deflections Martha had heard other men use, never pretending it had been clean or right, only noting that it was what had happened, and that knowing it honestly seemed to him important. She thought this was part of why she trusted him. He did not arrange the world into versions that made him comfortable. He looked at things as they were. The baby came in late March of 1880, on a night with a south wind blowing and the first hint of spring in the air. It was a long night, and Felipe, who had delivered many things in his long career with animals and had some experience with human deliveries as well, was enormously useful in the first hours until the midwife arrived from town. Jasper did not leave the house. He stayed in the room the entire time, holding Martha's hand when she wanted him to and staying out of the way when she needed the space, following her direction and the midwife's with absolute focused attention, doing whatever was asked of him with an efficiency that, under the circumstances, she would not fully appreciate until she thought back on it later. The baby was a boy. He arrived screaming, which the midwife said was ideal, a set of lungs that announced themselves to the world with conviction. He was placed in Martha's arms, and she looked at his red, indignant, perfect face, and felt something that had no name in the ordinary vocabulary, because it was too large for ordinary words, something that reorganized her understanding of the world from the inside out. Jasper sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and Martha watched his face and saw something she had never seen there before, a rawness completely without any armor on it at all, a pure, unguarded emotion that moved through him like water through open ground. "Hello," he said to the baby, quietly, as though they were being introduced at a careful distance that needed respecting. He said it with such complete seriousness and such complete tenderness that Martha started to laugh, softly, and the baby, as though responding to the sound, stopped screaming and looked in a generally indeterminate direction with the uncoordinated attention of the very newly arrived. They named him Thomas James Graves, Thomas for Jasper's brother and James for Martha's father who had died when she was 19. Thomas James was, from the beginning, an individual with opinions. He made his preferences known loudly and frequently, and without any apparent concern for the convenience of others, which Martha thought showed a certain admirable directness of character, even as it produced some very long nights. Jasper, who had told her he would be terrible at this, was in fact exactly as she had predicted, thoroughly devoted and almost entirely steady, woken by Thomas's crying without complaint, and walking the boards of the ranch house in the dark hours with the baby against his chest, with the same patience and focused attention he brought to everything that required it. The spring and summer of 1880 established itself as the period Martha would later think of as the fullest time of her life so far, not because it was without difficulty, because there was always difficulty, the drought in the summer again, the ongoing work of the ranch, a bad stretch in July when a neighboring rancher's fence came down, and 3 of his bulls got into the Double G's pasture and caused chaos before they were sorted out. And Thomas going through a month at around 4 months old of simply refusing to sleep for more than an hour at a time for reasons that no one could identify, and that resolved on their own as mysteriously as they had begun. But it was full, the word she always came back to, with work and love and purpose and the ongoing daily texture of a life being actively lived. She went back to the school in September, when Thomas was 6 months old and solid enough for Eliza, who had offered immediately and with great enthusiasm to take him for the school days. Clara Hobbs, the temporary teacher, had done well by the children and was glad to hand the school back, confiding to Martha that she had enormous respect for the work, but that her own ambition lay in a different direction, namely in marrying the young veterinarian who had come to town in the spring, which she accomplished in October with Martha and Jasper in attendance at the small ceremony. Anna Whitfield was 8 now and reading properly, independently, with confidence. She had moved on to the 2nd primer and was beginning the 3rd. On Martha's first day back, Anna walked up to her desk before lessons began and placed a small bunch of late-blooming wildflowers on it without a word, and then went back to her bench and sat down with the precise dignity of someone who has said everything that needs to be said. Martha kept the flowers in a tin cup of water on her desk for the whole week, until they were too far gone to keep. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was cold and long, with 2 significant snowstorms that were unusual for that part of Texas, and that kept the ranch roads impassable for several days at a stretch. Jasper spent those days working from the ranch, doing repairs on the outbuildings and maintenance work that accumulated in the seasons when there was no time for it, and Martha spent them with Thomas on the kitchen floor, surrounded by whatever small objects a 7-month-old and then an 8-month-old found interesting, which turned out to be a broad range of items including wooden spoons, empty tins, and his own feet, which he discovered with the delight of someone encountering an extraordinary new fact about the world. On the long snow evenings Jasper would come in from the cold with his coat covered in fine white and his beard rimed with frost, and he would wash up at the pump and sit at the kitchen table with Thomas on his knee while Martha cooked, and he would talk to the baby with the same seriousness and attention with which he talked to everyone, telling him about the ranch and the animals and the weather and what he had been doing outside, as though Thomas was a small person who deserved accurate information, which Martha thought. was exactly the right approach. Thomas learned to walk in May of 1881, in the kitchen, grabbing the table leg and releasing it and taking 3 steps and sitting down abruptly with an expression of enormous surprise on his face that made Jasper laugh out loud. The full laugh this time, not the quiet one, the one that filled the kitchen. And Martha stood at the stove with her hand over her mouth because Thomas's expression of surprise and Jasper's laugh together were the funniest and most wonderful thing she had seen in some time. Life moved forward. Thomas grew. The ranch prospered in the steady, incremental way of a thing managed with care and consistent effort rather than dramatic interventions. Martha's school continued, and she had begun, by 1882, to advocate to the town council for a second schoolroom and a second teacher to handle the increase in students that came with the town's continuing growth. She wrote the proposal herself and presented it in person to the 3-man council, and she made her case with the clarity and precision of someone who knows their subject and trusts the strength of the argument. The council approved it in September 1882, and the new room was built by November, and a new teacher, a young man named David Park who had trained in St. Louis and had come west for reasons he kept mostly to himself, joined the school in January of 1883. In the spring of 1883, Martha discovered she was expecting again. Thomas was 3, a confident, curious boy who had his father's dark eyes and his mother's directness, and who had recently developed a passionate interest in horses that was, on the double G, not difficult to encourage. Felipe, who had no children of his own, had adopted Thomas as a kind of project and was teaching him the proper way to approach a horse and the fundamentals of horsemanship with a patience and seriousness that made Jasper's eyes warm every time he watched them together. This pregnancy was easier than the first, or at least more familiar, in the way that all second experiences are shaped by the knowledge of what the first one was. The baby came in October of 1883, faster this time and at a more civilized hour of the morning, and she was a girl, a quiet and watchful baby from the beginning, with Martha's brown hair and Jasper's tendency to observe the world from a careful distance before deciding to engage with it. They named her Ruth Eliza Graves, Ruth for no specific reason beyond the fact that Martha had always liked the name, and Eliza for the woman who had taken her in on the first day, who was Ruth Eliza's godmother by unanimous consent, and who held the baby at the christening with an expression of total serenity that was one of the few times Martha had ever seen Eliza fully at rest. Thomas, who was 3.5, assessed his new sister with the gravity of someone whose territory has been modified, and who is reserving judgment on whether this is acceptable. Within a week he had decided that it was, and could be found sitting beside her whenever she was laid on a blanket on the kitchen floor, explaining to her carefully about horses. The years that followed were good years, textured and real and full in the way that genuine lives are full, with difficulty and joy and loss and growth all woven together into something that held together because the threads were strong. Eliza Marsh became part of the family's life in the complete way, Sunday dinners at the ranch becoming a fixture, Thomas and then Ruth growing up knowing her as a second grandmother. Felipe stayed on at the ranch for years, his knowledge and his steady presence a cornerstone of the Double G's daily life. Isaac, the young man from Georgia with the head for numbers, eventually saved enough to buy a small parcel of land north of town and start his own operation, and Jasper helped him with the setup in the practical way of a man who had been helped once and knew the weight of it. Sheriff Cecil Tate retired in 1885 and was replaced by a younger man, and the town continued to grow as the railroad finally arrived in 1886, 3 years behind the most optimistic projections but real at last, the iron track running through the edge of Redemption Creek and changing the sound and rhythm of the town in ways both welcome and strange. New businesses came, new people. The school became 3 rooms, and Martha became its principal while still teaching the older students herself. A title and a responsibility she accepted with the seriousness she applied to everything. She and Jasper walked the town together on the evening the first train pulled through, standing on the boardwalk with Thomas, who was 6 and wild with excitement, and Ruth, who was 3 and held between them with a small hand in each of their larger ones. And they watched the train move through and the town cheer around them. And Martha felt the particular pride of someone who has watched a place become more than it was and has been part of the becoming. Jasper's hand found hers in the crowd and held it without fanfare. She looked up at him. He was watching the train, his profile against the evening sky, the battered hat and the roughness of him and the absolute solid certainty of his presence beside her. "What are you thinking?" she asked under the noise of the crowd. He looked down at her and gave her the full smile, the one that had taken months to earn and which she treasured accordingly. "I am thinking that this is a good place," he said, "and a good life." She leaned her shoulder against his arm and looked back at the train and the cheering town. "It is," she said. Thomas pulled at Jasper's hand, wanting to get closer, and Jasper lifted him up onto his shoulders without effort. And Thomas crowed with delight from that elevation, and Ruth looked up at her brother and laughed. And around them Redemption Creek celebrated its railroad and its future with the full-throated enthusiasm of a place that has been working towards something and has finally arrived. The life they built continued to grow and to hold. The Double G expanded modestly in the late 1880s, adding a section of grazing land to the west, and increasing the horse breeding operation because Jasper had always understood horses as well as cattle, and the demand for well-bred working horses was consistent. Martha continued to run the school with the combination of practical intelligence and genuine care for her students that had always been her approach, and by 1888 she had 3 teachers working under her, and a school building with 4 rooms and proper desks, replacing the old bench and board arrangement that had been there when she arrived. Anna Whitfield, who had started as Martha's student at 7, and who had struggled to read and then learned, and then read everything she could lay hands on, was 14 by 1888 and was the best student in the school. And Martha was actively working to connect her family with information about educational opportunities beyond Redemption Creek, because a mind like Anna's deserved to go as far as it could reach. In the evenings, in the kitchen of the ranch house that had become so thoroughly home that Martha could not remember exactly when the transition from familiar to beloved had happened, she and Jasper sat at the table with the lamp lit, sometimes talking and sometimes reading in the companionable quiet that had been one of the great unexpected gifts of the life they had built. This ease of being in the same room without performance or demand, just present, just together. He still asked at intervals how she was sleeping, not every night, not even every week. But sometimes in the dark, he would say it in the quiet way he had said it the first time, and she would tell him, and she would tell him the truth, whatever the truth was, because that had been the foundation of it from the beginning, that she could be honest with him about the things that were hard and be met not with deflection or discomfort, but with the simple, solid presence of a man who was there and intended to stay. She was sleeping well. She had been sleeping well for years, but she loved him for asking. Thomas turned 10 in 1890 and was by now as comfortable on a horse as on his feet, and was learning the ranching work with Jasper in the systematic way that fathers teach sons the work they love, not through instruction manuals, but through working side by side, the knowledge passing from hand to hand through proximity and repetition, and the particular conversation of work done together. Ruth was 7 and had her mother's love of books and her father's patience, a combination that made her excellent at anything that required sustained attention and made her, in Thomas's view, a useful person to have around when you were trying to learn something difficult. In the spring of 1891, Eliza Marsh died. She had been ill through the winter, a chest complaint that the doctor managed but could not cure, and she went quietly in April, in her yellow house with the peeling paint that had been repainted twice since Martha arrived in town, in the room that had been Martha's first room in Redemption Creek, with Martha holding her hand and Jasper sitting on the other side of the bed in the chair that was too small for him with his hat in his lap. She had been Martha's first kindness in a new place, and the shape of her absence was specific and real. Martha grieved her with the completeness that comes from having loved someone honestly and long. And Jasper, who had known Eliza for years longer than Martha had, and who owed her something for having kept Martha safe and housed and steady in those first months before he had asked the right to take over that role himself, was quiet and steady through it the way he was always quiet and steady when things were hard, not immune to the loss but not broken by it, present in the way that mattered most. They buried Eliza in the church cemetery and the whole town came, which was the right measure of her. Life moved forward as it does. The grief of loss becomes part of the texture rather than the whole of it, and the texture remains rich and full because of all the living that is still happening around the places of loss. Thomas and Ruth grew. The ranch prospered. The school grew. Redemption Creek became, by the early 1890s, a town with actual permanence about it, the kind of place people came to and stayed in, with institutions and businesses and a history accreting around it year by year. On a Sunday evening in the fall of 1892, Martha sat on the front porch of the ranch house, watching the sun go down over the Texas flatland. Thomas was 12 and inside somewhere, probably looking at the natural history volume his father had added to the bookshelf years ago. Ruth was 9 and in the kitchen garden, which had become her particular domain, tending the late squash with the focused seriousness she brought to anything growing. Jasper came out and sat in the second chair beside her, the one that had always been there, and they watched the sunset together, which was elaborate that evening, the sky going through 4 distinct stages of color from the deep orange of the horizon up through rose and lavender to the first cold blue where the stars were beginning to show. "I have been thinking," Jasper said. "About what?" She said, "About adding the eastern pasture," he said. "The Carey family are looking to sell and the price is fair." She considered it. She knew the eastern pasture. She knew what it would mean for the Double G's capacity. "Do it," she said. He nodded slowly, still watching the sky. A pause. "How are you sleeping?" he asked. She looked at him, this man. This rough, careful, steady man with the scarred hands and the dark eyes, and the question that had been the beginning of everything between them, asked with the same genuine wanting to know that had been in it the very first time, in the kitchen of Eliza Marsh's boarding house at 2 in the morning 14 years ago, when she had been a widow in a new town, and he had been a solitary rancher with nowhere particular to be at that hour, and had seen the light and stopped because something in him, even then, had needed to know how she was. "Perfectly," she said. "I am sleeping perfectly." He turned to look at her, and she looked back at him, and the sun went all the way down, and the stars came up one by one over the ranch and the town and the wide-open Texas sky. And the light from the kitchen window, where Ruth was likely sneaking something sweet, fell warm and gold across the porch. And somewhere inside the house Thomas was probably reading about birds or horses or the topography of mountain ranges he had never seen. And the ranch was quiet and real around them. And everything that had needed to be built was built, and everything that had needed to be healed was healed, and the life they had made together out of 2 separate solitudes and 1 kitchen lamp, and the simple, patient question of "How are you sleeping?" was complete and good and whole. He took her hand. She held it. The stars came out in their thousands over Redemption Creek, Texas, in the fall of 1892, and the night was long and beautiful and quiet. And Martha Hawkins Graves, who had arrived in this place with a trunk and a carpetbag and a grief she had carried steadily and well, felt the particular deep peace of a woman who has found every single thing she did not know she was looking for, in a place she had not known to look for it, with the roughest man she had ever laid eyes on, who had been the first to ask how she was sleeping, and who had been asking ever since.